Trigger warning. This story contains references to sexual violence, physical abuse, and cannibalism in the form of a folkloric account. It is presented as a local legend and oral tradition, not as a confirmed historical record. Please take care while listening. They praised the broth as if it were a miracle. On that night, beneath white linen and flickering lamps, men who never saw the storms that fed the cane fields raised their bowls and called it comfort. They talked of harvests and fortunes, of favors owed and favors done. Steam curled from the wooden ladle in slow, almost reverent spirals. The taste was rich, smoky, familiar, the kind of flavor that settles on the tongue and claims you. What they did not know, what the region would whisper for decades after, was what made that broth the single most dangerous secret in the house of Boa Vista. Legend says the pot had simmered with bones that once carried a man's weight, bones that had been the backbone of power at that very table. The story, as told around fires and in doorways, names the man, Coronel Custodio de Almeida, owner of the plantation, lord of the Casa Grande, the man who trafficked in people and silence. But the truth, as any storyteller from the Recôncavo might warn you, is tangled with memory. Some call it a rumor that grew until it filled the countryside. Others insist it was vengeance dressed in a cook's apron. What follows moves between what was recorded in few papers, what was reported in old letters, and what the oral tradition remembers, sometimes contradictory, always sharp. It is the tale of Rosa, the cook of Boa Vista, and of a broth that made men taste their own complicity. Boa Vista sat low in the map of the Recôncavo Baiano, where the land smells of cane and river mud. Plantations like it made their fortunes on sugar, and their orders were obeyed by a social architecture as rigid as a fence post. The house, whitewashed, tall, with hurricane shutters, kept its daylight for the family and its shadows for those who worked. The senzala lay beyond the garden, a cluster of small windows and low doors, where the lives of many were measured in hours and permission. Coronel Custodio had a reputation that traveled faster than his carriage. He was a man in his 50s when the story takes shape, robust in appearance, practiced in the language of threats and bargains. He attended to the town's affairs with the same hands that took freedoms, a commissioner of favors, a neighbor to other colonels, a patron to merchants, and a regular in the pews beside the parish priest. His wife, Donna Amelia, was often described in the oral accounts as pale and devout, a woman whose prayers seemed to be used as a curtain for things she could not name. The priest, the merchants, the neighboring colonels, these were not simple caricatures in the stories. They were complications, men who benefited from a system and who turned away from its cruelties, or who saw them as part of the cost of being a man of standing. Rosa was born into the plantation's world. Accounts vary about her exact age and origin. In most tellings, she arrived as a child, learned the flame and the measure, and grew into a cook with hands that knew every temper of heat. She became indispensable to the Casa Grande over the years. No banquet without her, no season without her spice. Women in the kitchen called her a mistress of stockpots and of timing. She bore 3 children in the shadows of that house. 2 boys were sold away when they were still green with childhood. A baby died under circumstances the stories soften. Some say disease. Others say what better suits the anger in the telling. An infant who did not survive the house's indifference. The loss of those children becomes the hinge of the narrative. What the oral memory keeps returning to is not simply the act of sale, but the pattern of indignities that made a life into something owed and taken. The daily cruelties stack in the telling like plates. Rosa was whipped in front of others, her skin and dignity catalogued as an example. She was humiliated in public, dismissed as property by a system that formalized ownership of bodies. The stories say he assaulted her. Again, storytellers spare the detail, and the script demands the same restraint. There was repeated sexual violence, a violation that is treated in the narrative as a blunt, moral fact rather than an object of lurid description. Once, when a child under her care spoke back, Custodio made an example of the boy. He was taken and sold, and the trade was announced like a ledger entry. The priest blessed the bread. The merchants clinked glasses. Life went on. These are the things the legend lays before us to explain the transformation in Rosa. There is a long moment in the stories where grief compresses into a cold attention. Not all victims become vengeful. Not all who are humiliated plan. Rosa, by the telling, did neither out of a sudden madness nor out of a lawless bloodlust. She watched. She remembered. She learned the rhythms of the house. When the colonel drank, where the servants slept, which gate gave no sound when closed. She practiced patience the way a cook practices timing, watching the oven, knowing when to add salt. The turning point in many retellings is the night the two boys were sold. Some say it was 1875, some put it elsewhere in the small gray space of memory. That sale marked something that words call total loss. With 2 children gone and the 3rd child long dead, things that were once owned became the only things left to be taken. After that night, Rosa shifted. Her sorrow hardened, not into hatred alone, but into a problem to be solved. There is a cruelty to planning under oppression that the oral tradition frames as an act of calculation. Rosa watched the colonel drink more than was wise. In countless stories about the power dynamics on plantations, alcohol is the solvent that loosened the unwary man's sense. Custodio would walk the garden after supper, leaning on cane rails as if the world owed him steadiness. He kept certain routines that a servant could memorize: the moment he took his cigar, the pocket where he kept his keys, the way he slept with the shutters open toward the wind. She catalogued these things like a housekeeper takes inventory, not for pride, but for survival. We must not get lost in the mechanics of planning. The legend is careful to leave the violent act off stage. It wants us to know there was a night, and that the colonel died. It wants us to feel the hush that comes to a house when a landlord's voice stops. The killing, when described in the stories, is not theatricalized. It is a necessary event in the moral economy of the narrative, an answer to unbearable injustice, an ultimatum set in motion by someone who had nothing left to lose. The stories emphasize how quietly the act is done and how much it relies on knowledge only Rosa could have. Which rooms had no watchers, which gate opened to a narrow path, which workers were sworn to silence. What follows in the tradition is less a legal procedure than a culinary one. The body, as the tale goes, was moved away from the great house and taken to the realm that belonged to the kitchen, the courtyard near the pig yard, where the caldera stood. The caldera is a kind of iron pot or boiler common to large plantations, used for making lard, curing meat, and feeding many mouths. It is a symbol in the stories, a place where heat transforms matter. In this narrative, the caldera becomes a crucible of reversal. Bones, the stories say, were boiled down into a thick, smoky stock. The accounts are careful, intentionally or by custom, to avoid anatomical specifics. They linger instead on steam, on the darkness of the night, on the sound of the ladle against iron, and the way Rosa's hands, which had fed so many, moved with a method that had been both learned and sharpened by suffering. This is where the legend tightens its grip. The broth, once seasoned and strained, was served at a banquet for the local elite. It was an evening the oral memory preserves in dazzle, silverware gleaming like teeth, the music of clinking spoon against bowl, the laughter that knows no hunger. The guests were the usual, neighbors and colonels, a priest to bless the meal, merchants with ledgers underarm, and once again, Donna Amelia, whose pale hands folded the napkin at her throat. They spoke of crops and of who owed whom a favor. They spoke, as the stories like to note, of the colonel's recent ventures, his absence explained by a journey or misadventure. Rosa stood at the hearth and served. The accounts emphasize her composure, not the wildness of an avenger, but the cool attention of someone who must hide a truth in plain sight. When she ladled the broth, she moved like any cook, Steady wrist, measured spoon. The guests tasted. They praised. They called for more. "How did she get that depth?" someone asked. "A secret stock," another suggested. "Rosa has a gift," replied a man who had never known the hand that served him. If you listen to the way the legend is told at small gatherings, the most brutal image is not the bones nor the pot. It is the faces at the table, eating. The stories slow there, fix on the eyes of the men as they lean back from their bowls. Some versions have people noticing a cook's peculiar serenity. Others report a whisper that made the rounds, a servant, a neighbor, a child who had found a scrap of cloth stained with something that could not be simply wine. Rumor, once seeded, grew like mold in a damp cellar. The colonel's absence, the sudden quiet in the house, and the strange richness of the broth combined into a suspicion that galloped through the countryside. The first ripple was disbelief. Men laughed it off. Some suggested rival colonels had cooked up the rumor to unsettle the family. Others, especially those who had watched Rosa fade under blows and theft, saw it and smiled with a different feeling. The priest, in many tellings, said nothing. Silence, in this world, is its own sermon. The merchants closed their ledgers a little quicker. The neighbors adjusted their greetings. Fear is not always loud. Sometimes it rearranges posture, lowers the volume of jokes, makes men cross the road rather than meet an eye. That fear had consequence. For a while, the colonels who owned plantations like Boa Vista took to showing less swagger in the market. They avoided certain taverns. They insisted on locks and on more watchers. The oral tradition credits the story with a softening, or at least a recalibration, of swagger into caution. A few say it led to innocenter acts, reparations whispered in private, a shift in how some treated their household staff. Others insist the change was only skin deep. The system remained, and most of its operators continued as always. But whether the threat to their bodies or to their reputations, the men of rank felt that they might be less invulnerable than before. Rosa's life after that night, in the legends, is split between two modes, survival and secrecy. Some accounts say she was turned out of the house to protect her. Others say she stayed, famously unarrested, shielded perhaps by the very complicity that had allowed the plantation's order. In one common telling, she was sold in 1878, an act that carried other meanings in the tales: punishment, silencing, or simply another transaction in a world that commodified people. She survived to see abolition in 1888, when the law changed, though the law could not wholly change the patterns of memory. Many versions of the story place her final confession in 1890, when an elderly Rosa, perhaps with silver in her hair and the lines of years in her palms, sat with two granddaughters and spoke in a voice that was, according to those who would later tell her words, weary and precise. Here the narrator moves closer. The oral tradition gives us a moment of intimacy. Rosa, near death, imparting a truth that is part apology, part claim. She is quoted, in fragments. "They ate what fed them," she is said to have told them. "He ate my sons. I made him food for those who consumed him." The line stands as the moral fulcrum of the legend. It is pithy and terrible in its symmetry. The words are reported, not corroborated. Some elders insist they heard her say them in the small kitchen of a rented house, while others maintain that the line is a later flourish, grown from the need to shape meaning from a story that resists tidy moralization. That line, "He ate my life. I made him food for those who consumed him," works in the tale as both denouement and question. Was it justice? Was it a monstrous revenge? The stories refuse a simple answer. Instead, they leave us with the image of consumption turned back on its owners. The metaphor is cruelly apt. A social order that devoured lives now tastes its own product. The moral complexity is precisely the point. The legend asks the listener to consider how deshumanization breeds response, and whether punishment by the oppressed can be considered justice, or merely another cycle of degradation. It is essential to frame this story within its historical context. The Reconcavo, was a place of sugar and salt, of wealth built on the backs of those denied freedom. Plantations like Boa Vista depended on enslaved labor. The social and legal structures served to reproduce inequality. Abolition in 1888 changed the law, but not necessarily the memory or the grief that lingered. The accounts of Rosa are part of an oral tradition that operated in the space left by scant official records. Where court documents are absent, where ledgers remain the only clear traces of transactions, stories like this one offer a different kind of history, memory shaped by pain, survival, and community storytelling. Historians and storytellers alike must treat such narrations with care, recognizing their power and their limits. Some elements are indefinido, uncertain and unconfirmed by archival proof. Calling them legend is not to dismiss their truth, but to acknowledge that they live in the testimony of people, rather than in certified documents. Across years, the legend of the bone broth mutated into a regional caution and a private triumph. It appeared in songs and in warnings whispered to children who wandered too close to the Casas Grande. In certain barrooms, it became an anecdote for lowering a voice when talking of power. In other places, the story inspired darker imitations or fueled fantasies nobody should endorse. For every teller who frames Rosa as an avenging angel of the downtrodden, another insists on the danger of glorifying violence. The moral tension is real and intended in the tradition. It warns against celebrating brutality, even as it allows the listener to feel the force of righteous indignation. Critical readers will ask, what happened legally? Was anyone tried? Did Donna Amelia know? The oral accounts provide no neat court record. The priest's silence is itself a historical footnote. What he did and did not say reflects the entanglement of church and power in the region. Donna Amelia, in some tellings, is depicted as distant, as if devotion had replaced the kind of intimacy that might have revealed a betrayal. In other versions, she is more ambiguously involved, complicit by omission rather than by action. The neighbors, Colonel Antonio and others, feature as mouths full of broth and hands, quick to turn away from the destabilizing possibility that their table sat atop a grave. The merchants are the ones who kept the accounts, who balanced the books, and thus had to consider how rumors could affect trade. All of them are necessary to the story, because the legend is not only about one act, it is about the social fabric that allowed the act to be conceivable. One thing the stories agree upon is that the legend of Rosa became a kind of ledger of memory. When people tell it, they mark time and feeling. They recall the sound of the caldera, the steam like a ghost rising from bowls, and the taste of a broth that carried a secret. They remember the strange hush in the market afterward, and they remember the way some men began to lower their eyes, as if to conceal the knowledge of what they had eaten. The legend became a moral instrument, a reminder that those in power can be made small, and that suffering can give rise to acts that even the law cannot easily hold in its neat accounts. There is in the telling an ethical knot. The story forces us to ask whether a person pushed so far by theft of children, by public humiliation, by violent violation, might be driven to respond in a way that transgresses the moral codes we like to hold. If Rosa did as the story says, was it an act of justice, of vengeance, or of survival? The legend does not allow us to step outside the emotion and pretend we can pass a clean judgment. It instead presses us to face the structural violence that makes such a response thinkable. The narrator in these tales often leans into a dry, almost ironic clarity at moments like this. The moral world of the plantation allowed certain men to act with impunity. It also made certain actions by the oppressed impossible to publicize without danger. If you want justice, the stories seem to say, you must expect it to be messy and partial. Rosa's alleged revenge does not erase the system that made it conceivable. It is instead a symptom of a larger disease, a social order that ate people's lives like a meal. In many versions, the final years of Rosa's life are quieter. She is not celebrated in newspapers. Her name does not become a banner. Instead, she survives in the small and persistent ways that oral tradition feeds on. Through whispered recollections, through grandchildren who remember an old woman who stirred slowly, and spoke in sentences that carried the weight of a world. Her supposed final statement, about making him food for those who consumed him, is less a confession than a claim. Claims like that are how people who have been erased assert themselves. They reconfigure the narrative from being the subject of a ledger to being the author of a story. What remains, beyond the bitter poetry of that one line, is a question that echoes. What do we do with memories forged under domination? Do we turn them into history by force of documents and trial records, often unavailable or biased? Or do we allow oral tradition its own kind of truth, partial, wounded, and complicated? The story of the bone broth sits in that borderlands. It is a myth for some, a warning for others, and for a few a moral reckoning. It tells us about the cruelty of certain men, the endurance of those who were bound to serve them, and the lengths to which a human being might go when stripped of kin and dignity. Listen to the way the tale ends in the evening hours of the campo. People still say the steam from a pot on a cool night smells like memory. They speak of a woman who moved through a heat she did not make, who turned that heat into a statement. They speak of colonels who learned to look over their shoulders. They speak, sometimes contrite, sometimes boastful, of a broth that changed how the community measured safety. Whether or not the bones were ever truly those of Coronel Custodio, the story itself became something that could be consumed and contemplated. It asked the region to taste its own history and to judge the flavor. If this story intrigues you, subscribe for more legends from the Recôncavo and other corners where history and memory collide. There are other, darker consequences told by the old-timers. In some pockets, the legend emboldened people to imagine other acts of retribution. In others, it made the plantation owners stricter, harsher in private so as to prevent such a public undoing. The cycle of fear it spawned had no tidy moral solution. It served as both deterrent and provocation. The oral accounts, again, stress uncertainty. Sometimes the changes in behavior were small. Sometimes they were profound. Most often, they were uneven, imperfect echoes of a single act's shock. It is worth ending with a few reflections. First, stories like this one are not invitations. They do not recommend violence. Rather, they reveal what can happen when a human being is repeatedly dehumanized. The narrative is a mirror held up to a society that allows certain cruelties. What reflects back is not only the action, but the deeper architecture that enabled it. Second, the story highlights how memory compensates for the absence of records. When official documents fail to name the suffering of the many, oral tradition names them. It creates a history that is moral and human, stitched from the fragments of names and tastes, and the cadence of kitchens. Third, the tale insists on ambiguity. Rosa is not reduced to monster or saint. She is, in these versions, a complex human figure shaped by forces too large for a single life. And finally, in the voice attributed to her at the end of the tale, if the oral witnesses are to be believed, Rosa distilled the story's bitter symmetry. He ate my life. I made him food for those who consumed him. Whether these words were spoken, or later attached to her by a community hungry for closure, they remain the line that gives this legend its point. A metaphor of consumption reversed, a reprimand to a world that had turned people into something to be bought, used, and forgotten. If you have thoughts or one-word reactions, leave a comment below with the word broth. Tell us, did she find justice, or did she cross a line? Engage with the ambiguity. Share the story with someone who appreciates how legends keep wounds alive and how memory can transform pain into narrative restraint.